Hi everyone. So Jimmy really explained all the math to you, so we're not going to get into that. It must be absolutely clear by now. But anyway, welcome to Professor Chandrasekhar Khare, or Shekhar. And we will be chatting about his book, Chasing a Conjecture. And I want to start by talking about personally for me how it felt to read the book. And first of all, thank you for writing Chasing a Conjecture. I mean, there are layers of beauty to this book. Um, the overarching story is, of course, of your mathematical endeavor to prove Sayre's conjecture, as was eloquently explained just now, which won the Fermat Prize in 2007. But it's not just a story of your math, but also of other great mathematicians on whose work you build upon. We have Fermat, we have Andrew Wiles, Galois, Ramanujan, Sayre, of course, and your PhD advisor, your unofficial PhD advisor, and so many more. Um, but besides that, besides the math and your struggles with proving the conjecture, the book has these other complex threads, your writings about how music makes you feel and how you see the connections between doing math and musicians doing what they do. Um, there are other issues to do with making a home in a foreign land. And anyone who has left one home and tried to make another somewhere else can attest to the difficulty of that. So all of these things make for a very complex, layered narrative, and the book is really amazing. So again, thank you for writing.
Thank you.
Um, and just to, so one of the things that the book does really well is, as you might have noticed when Jimmy talked about the math that Shekhar works on is so esoteric that there must be just, I would imagine, I don't know, 20, 30 people in the world who would probably understand that level of math, or maybe more, a little bit more.
No, yeah, certainly more than 20, 30.
Okay, maybe, but not a whole lot more.
But
Right?
endangered species.
They are an endangered species, yes. So, but what he does beautifully in the book is in the very beginning, he sets the stage for readers to not be intimidated by the math, using some ideas about how he does math and what mathematicians do, and how readers could potentially also think of reading this book in a similar manner. So, Shekhar, if we may, can we start by you reading a paragraph
Yeah.
to start with, and page
So as I
4.
was joking with Anil, one of the things I try to do in this book is recreate for you the experience of most mathematicians. That is, when they read a piece of mathematics, they don't understand most of it at the first go. So when you read this book, I mean, there is a little bit of math and you will be introduced to the true mathematical experience. But, so I'm going to read a paragraph which addresses that predicament of a potential reader. One of the qualities that a mathematician needs is the ability to read a mathematical work without insisting on understanding everything, skipping paths that seem impenetrable at a first reading, moving past these thickets, and yet getting a sense of the work without having understood all of it. Skipping strategically is an art and a very useful skill to develop for a mathematician. I ask that the reader of this book also be willing to skip parts that seem too abstruse and press on.
And honestly, it works very beautifully, because when I started reading it in the beginning, I noticed that I was stopping trying to make sense of the math, and then quickly realized that, okay, this math is way beyond my abilities, but there's a way in which you can start reading it that allows you to get the gist. Well, not even the gist, I don't even know what I got in terms of the math, but you start getting an idea of just how complex this is. And that is the main point of this whole book, is that there is something very profound that has been done, and you get a sense for how difficult it was. And it is, as uh, Shekhar says in the in the acknowledgements, that this could have been any mathematician's journey, and he's writing it because he knows himself the best, and it is one story to be told, but it could have been almost any mathematician's journey. So Shekhar, there is a thread that runs throughout this book, this notion of an arduous journey. So normally when we think of mathematicians, we think of isolated geniuses just coming up with things. You have a very different take on what it means to do mathematics in this book, and you are constantly comparing it to the arduous journeys of people in other artistic endeavors. You talk of Bhimsen Joshi, Johann Sebastian Bach, even your grandfather, and you write that I was drawn to artists who were not successful to begin with. My saints were the dogged ones like Cezanne, who grappled with his art and found his style after a long struggle. So tell us a bit about this approach and, how you saw these connections between music and math.
Yeah, so maybe in some ways, as a friend told me, the reason I did math was not that I was particularly good at it. I mean, I was reasonably good at it, but because I got interested in it. So in some ways, the interest drove my wanting to do mathematics. And so my story is not the story of a genius who just went and conquered all that was there to conquer. It was someone who struggled. Someone who had I think what kept me going was a serious interest in the subject, a desire to contribute. But I felt lost several times as a graduate student, especially. I struggled mightily. I recount like a kind of pastiche or a recount of time I failed my exam in Caltech when I was a grad student. And somehow sort of all those traumas, right? I think many people have to deal with this. And the part of the book is about how to survive these crises. And of course, when the crises happen, they seem overwhelming in the moment. And but then when you actually have survived them, you can look back and draw strength from them, because in some ways, failures you survive teach you a lot, right? So somehow for example, I cherish my struggles now. I didn't cherish them then, but I do. They make you what you are. And in some ways, the point is that the struggle brings you in some ways closer to a subject, because it brings you an intimacy with the subject, which if you were very blithe and you could just breeze through it, you may not have that. Yeah. So I feel, for example, Bhimsen Joshi, I recount the story of him hearing Abdul Karim Khan's music at a shop near his house and being maddened by the music and going in search of a guru. So these kind of journeys, these kind of life devoted to something which really interests you, those have always inspired me. Not that I live up to those idols I invoke, but they've been inspiring.
I would love for you to read one more paragraph for us. I think it's on page 35 or something, about Thairav and...
Yeah. So somehow I think in high school, I became seriously interested perhaps in music, mathematics and literature. So this thing kind of talks about making some connection between my interest in math and interest in music. So this is recounting my getting interested in music when I was late high school, or perhaps as a teenager. So I became aware and was increasingly drawn to a quality called Thairav that is prized in Indian classical music. This is a quality of stillness, the ability to stay with a note, with a thought, without trying to force a conclusion, instead letting a mood unfold. As I listened more, I found that this was the most important quality in a musical performance, requiring maturity and skill and confidence. When I became a mathematics researcher, the notion of Thairav resonated with me even more. The ability to stay with a thought and give it a chance to evolve without interfering and blocking it with predetermined ideas seemed essential. One could discover something new only if one was willing to sustain periods of uncertainty and live with the suspense of not being in control. This was not the same as tenacity. Thairav was something that was present in the moment, a certain restraint in a mind that was eager and watchful, tense yet forbearing, while tenacity was more about not giving up on something you were pursuing.
I think that segues nicely into your mathematical endeavor, because the conjecture that you proved, the entire mathematical community lived with uncertainty for 350 years, right? I mean, so, and if you thought that we are done with the math, not really. I am as much a geek as anyone else, so we're going to get into a little bit of math now, and hopefully we will be able to give you a sense for just how sort of the arc of the mathematical history of this field that Shekhar was tackling. So I'll set up the easy part, and then I'll let Shekhar deal with the more difficult parts. But it begins with something called Fermat's last theorem. Fermat was a French mathematician who in 1637 jotted down on the margins of a notebook an assertion that then confounded people for 350 years. And that assertion is actually ridiculously simple when you just look at it. Most people who have done some math would know about Pythagoras theorem, where you write this equation x square plus y square is equal to z square. Fermat's equation was a generalized form of that. He said the equation was x to the power of n plus y to the power of n is equal to z to the power of n. And his assertion was that that equation had no whole number solutions for n greater than 2. So if you had x cube plus y cube is equal to z cube, you could not find whole number solutions of x and y and z that satisfied that equation. Have I got it right?
Yeah.
Cool. And he just jotted it down on the margins of a notebook. Apparently, he said he knew the proof, but there was no proof. And it took 350 years. I mean, this simple statement, it took 350 years for mathematicians to figure out how to prove this. And I'll let Shekhar talk about that arc from, when Fermat jotted this down to when Shekhar proved a very important part of something that's related to the solution of Fermat's last theorem. So Shekhar, all yours.
So, one of the things I think mathematicians value in mathematics is the fact that it has a very rich history. People have been doing it for thousands of years. So, for example, this problem of Fermat, this problem of Fermat is 350 years old. I mean, the problem by itself is a mere riddle. I mean, it has no real great, larger theoretical significance. A great mathematician, I mean, at that time there were no mathematicians, so it was Fermat. Fermat was, I think, a judge in Toulouse and did mathematics as a hobby on the side. But so Fermat jotted down this statement and saying he had a marvelous demonstration and no one could prove it. And that set off mathematicians on a wild goose chase or a long journey. Some great, I mean, Gauss, for example, one of the greatest mathematicians of all times, dismissed this as some sort of random question, why should one bother about it, right? So these were some of the reactions. But some people kind of were intrigued by this question, and especially a great man like Fermat had said he had found a solution and no one could reproduce the solution. So there was this long journey that mathematics took, and in some ways these are questions, in some ways the kind of mathematics I do is called number theory. So it's about the usual numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4. In some ways they're the simplest of all mathematical objects. If you want to say something is easy, you say it is as easy as 1, 2, 3. But the actual fact is that some of the hardest questions in mathematics are about the simplest of all objects, numbers. And in some ways, the charm of number theory is kind of or perhaps of mathematics in general, or at least many parts of it, is the kind of difference or the kind of gap between the simplicity of the question. So it seems kind of some question which you should be able to figure out if you kind of just fool around with pen and paper for a few days but the simplicity of the question, and sometimes the answers kind of are way, way out there. So it took 350 years to solve to kind of actually prove that Fermat was right in a sense. Though he was wrong, people think that he thought he had a proof, but he really didn't. Because in some ways in mathematics, one can certainly, even the greatest of mathematicians can make mistakes, and he might have kind of skipped a step or something. But the point is that the fact that Fermat's last theorem resisted solution made the greatest minds work on it very hard, and they developed sort of elaborate theories to try and find an approach. They kept on failing. For 350 years, no one succeeded. But the kind of infrastructure of number theory or mathematics they built up, later on, almost as an afterthought, solved the question. Right? So this was this miraculous moment in 1994 when Andrew Wiles, who was a 10-year-old boy in Cambridge, had come upon this question in a book in a library in Cambridge. He kind of fulfilled his childhood ambition by proving this theorem as a consequence of some much deeper theoretical mathematics. So this kind of is kind of often the arc of mathematics. You start with a simple question, it resists solution. The fact that it resists solutions, it offers kind of resistance to thought, kind of makes mathematicians who are very stubborn people want to solve it more and more. They develop theories, and in the end, the theories in some ways are more important than just the mere act of solving the question. But it's kind of a good way of keeping score if newer mathematics solves classical problems.
And in terms of the big developments, we had Galois and Ramanujan, Jean-Pierre Serre, and a whole bunch of others, eventually leading up to Andrew Wiles coming up with the proof, right?
Yes.
So there were really, really big mathematical breakthroughs that had happened along the way that finally got put together to prove Fermat's last theorem. And somewhere in that was Sayre's conjecture, which was necessary for that proof. And your entire effort has been to prove Sayre's conjecture itself, right?
Yeah.
And and that is the story of, that's the story that's narrated in the book, right? And how Shekhar goes about throughout his career. I mean, there was a fascination with Sayre from your early days because you had read some book of his, you bought in Mumbai in a bookstore, right? But anyway, so the book kind of lays the groundwork for this journey where Shekhar starts off in Mumbai and then goes to Cambridge to study mathematics. From there, a brief stint in Oxford where he is distinctly unhappy from the sound of it, and then goes to Caltech to finish his PhD, and the bulk of the work gets done at Caltech. There are some incredible moments during the last 6 months or so of his PhD where he spends time in Allahabad for 3 months and 3 months in Sapporo, Japan at mathematical institutes. And then comes back to Caltech, and there's very clear descriptions of the breakthroughs that are happening in his mind that then lead him to come up with a thesis or finish his thesis, which is a stepping stone to proving Sayre's conjecture, right? So I just wanted to talk about some of these places that you studied at. What was it like, for instance, to be doing mathematics in Cambridge, in Trinity College? I mean, these are places where, this is a place where Newton and Hardy and Ramanujan have all done their work. So how did it feel?
Yeah, I mean, it felt kind of, it was overawing, exciting, depressing at times because there were always students much smarter than me. But one learned that even if there are people smarter than you, that you can you learn how to sort of appreciate people for how smart they are, but then also feel that, okay, you have to find a way to, in spite of that, try and survive and find your path. And also in some ways in Cambridge, for example, I was inspired by they had very good faculty. In particular, there was somebody called John Thompson who kind of attract. I mean, in some ways, I'm drawn to people who seem kind of, I don't know, a little bit unworldly, mysterious. So John Thompson had this quality of being he seemed to sort of be a seer of some sort. So to be inspired by people is somehow one of my qualities. Maybe as an Indian, in some ways, one is looking for gurus. So to finding role models, right, and finding inspiration in people is a trait I think I have, and somehow that had scope to find people to kind of focus on by being in Cambridge and being at these other institutions.
And you, for your interview at Oxford, you had Andrew Wiles in the committee who was interviewing you?
Yeah.
And how was that? You said he didn't ask a single question, basically.
Yeah, it was a very kind of disappointing interview. I kind of went as a timidly kind of thinking what was going to happen at this interview. Took a 3-hour bus ride from Cambridge. I was studying at Cambridge, then went to Oxford. Then there were these three rather well-known number theorists in the room. They didn't ask me a single math question. And after half an hour, I walked out and went back rather depressed to Cambridge, taking the 3-hour bus journey back. So I mean, in some ways, it was both inspiring to be in the presence of people of that stature, and also a bit kind of worrying that they didn't ask me a single math question.
But your sort of intersections with Andrew Wiles, was that somehow connected to what you ended up doing?
In some ways, it was a case of maybe unrequited love, because, okay, when I saw Andrew Wiles, I knew that at that stage, even at that stage, he was a well-known mathematician. Later, he became a celebrity in the world of mathematics by solving Fermat's last theorem. But even then, he was a professor at Princeton, and so he had done important work. So somehow, something in his personality drew me to him. Again, I think what attracted me was a quietness about him. I mean, he was not trying to push anything, or he was just quiet. And quietness sometimes kind of draws me sometimes, or often. So and somehow I had this desire to work with him. But then when I went back, so in spite of them not asking me a single math question, they somehow offered me a place to do a PhD, and I took it up. But when I went to Oxford, Wiles had gone back to Princeton. So it was a case of unrequited love, right? And whatever, I wanted to work with him, but he was not there. So he kind of, as I say in the book, it was, he became a kind of imaginary guru in my mind. Something which I kind of resort to. I mean, one wants role models, but of course one can't have access to them. They may not be available in real life, but you can kind of draw inspiration from your sense of them. You don't even know them, but your sense of them. So they're like internalized. They're internal gurus which draw from their external guru. But of course, it's also based on the work they've done, trying to understand what they've done,
Right.
struggling with it. But that biographical embodiment of a subject is, I think, important to me. I can't just directly go to the math. In some ways, I need some sort of human connect to try and approach the math.
And so from there, Oxford was a short stint. You decided to move to Caltech, and that's where you continued doing your PhD. And one of the nicest parts of the writing in the book is a section where you're talking about how your advisor or your unofficial advisor, because you had found somebody to advise you for your PhD thesis who was not official, and a Japanese mathematician called Hida.
Yeah.
Right? So, and he had given you problems to work on, and you decided that that's not what you wanted to do, and you started getting obsessed by a paper that had been written by a mathematician at Berkeley, Ken Ribet. And there's a few paragraphs here that describe your obsession with that. So would you mind reading that for us? I think it's page 99.
First of all, I should correct what Anil said. It's not that I did not want to work on what Hida suggested. I just couldn't. I mean, I couldn't solve those questions. And as I said, I was joking with Anil. If I had a graduate student like myself who didn't listen to me and didn't work on the problems I suggested, I would probably fire him. So, but Hida, my advisor, kind of allowed me to drift around and find my way. So, okay, and now I'll read this.
Yeah.
So this is about grappling with this paper of Ken Ribet, who was a professor at Berkeley, whose kind of mathematics I became fascinated with. Part of the fascination was that his work, again, showed that it had a connection with Fermat's last theorem. So somehow it had a notoriety in the community at that time, and I decided to plunge into it and struggled with it. Okay. So I tried different techniques to read the paper. I tried to understand it linearly, line by line, and found myself stuck in infinite regress. If I looked up a reference in the bibliography, the reference would sometimes be to a tome full of the most arcane mathematics. Sometimes the reference was to a shorter paper, but then that itself would refer to other works. Perhaps I could reconnoiter over the expanse of the paper to try and get a bird's eye view. The problem was I didn't know enough about the basic structure of the type of number theory this paper was situated in. The blurs of greens and browns and blues I saw from hovering above the paper did not make me any wiser about the lay of the land. There were periods of excitement nevertheless. Sometimes when I read the paper, it felt like flying in a cockpit, low over the terrain, with the sun directly in my eyes, almost blinding me. These solo flights gave me a secret thrill. Secret because initially I did not tell my advisor that I was spending more time reading this paper than working on the problem he had suggested. The notation was befuddling. Even granted all the machinery in those few months struggling with the paper, I was still confused about the strategy of the proof. Yet, I kept getting a kick out of the paper. I understood a couple of sections towards the end. The maths of the paper seemed fresh and contemporary. I admired the style of the author. The paper was my constant companion on trains, on buses. Sometimes I carried it in my hands on my walks, looked at it as I waited to cross a street at a light. Looking at the paper quietened my mind. The first and last pages were getting increasingly soiled. The binding was loosening as if the pages physically wanted to escape from me. Sometimes I spotted a mistake, a hidden contradiction in the argument. This made me briefly happy. I had seen a flaw no one else had. I could at least gain a sort of negative fame as a debunker. Alas, the contradiction resolved itself. But through these stumbles, my understanding grew. I was still hazy about many parts of the paper. It was a little like skating on a river that was frozen over, but had hidden cracks in the ice. After having fallen frequently into icy cold water at the beginning, the periods I stayed above water grew longer and longer. I could even attempt a few complicated maneuvers to show off my understanding.
Very nice. Thank you. And this was before you went to Allahabad and Sapporo.
Yeah.
So talk about that phase, because that seems in the book. The book is very distinct in its phases, and one of the phases is very clearly Shekhar struggling as a PhD student in Caltech. He has very, very self-aware descriptions of his self-doubt, convinced that he's not doing anything worthwhile. And as a reader, you are getting tense for him, because it's just, especially there's a recounting. You talked about failing that oral examination. He recounts that he's dramatized it probably literally that's what happened, right? I mean, it's like reading a scene from a play. And honestly, if any of you have sat in one of these exams, that is very traumatic to read, because you can almost imagine as a student feeling the pain of that whole event. That was very amazing writing. But then you go to Allahabad and Sapporo, a change of scene. So talk a little bit about how that led to eventually your breakthroughs for this PhD thesis.
Yeah, so that was indeed, as Anil said, a harrowing time. In fact, probably because it's so far away. I mean, I do not remember the despair I felt that way. So the book has a lighter tone than what I really felt that time. So I kind of was struggling at Caltech, and then HIDA gave me the opportunity of sort of my advisor, my Japanese advisor. He was spending the summer or something in Sapporo, which is a city in the northern part of Japan. He said I could come along and see whether I could make progress with my thesis. So there's a section called Escaping Pasadena, because somehow Pasadena, which is where Caltech is, near Los Angeles, had become very suffocating. I was like, for 3-4 years, nothing was happening. There was stasis. I wanted to escape that. So this was an opportunity to geographically kind of at least get away from these feelings of failure. And so in Sapporo, I was totally on my own. I was just walking for many hours a day, trying to figure out, trying to think, obsess about a problem, obsess about what I had been asked to think about. But again, I was not succeeding. But on the other hand, what happened was that I posed to myself a question, which I call in the book the Sapporo question. So once that question I posed to myself, somehow things started moving. And the reason I feel this might have happened is because of the fact that I had posed the question myself, I somehow felt emotionally more invested in it, and I felt perhaps a greater right to think about it, and somehow that, I think, eventually led to my breakthrough in the question when I went back to Caltech. So, but these kind of changes of geographical locales and so on, I've often found, though there's no direct connection one can draw between just traveling on a train or flying on a plane or something, but just moving sometimes can get one even mentally unstuck. So physical movement can result in kind of deadlocks resolving themselves in the mind.
So there's a lot of walking in the book. You're walking in the streets of Sapporo, or you're walking through the lanes of Mumbai's Chor Bazaar and doing math in your head. So that's pretty cool. You talk in the book of yourself as someone who has an appetite for long-term risks, and you're averse to short-term risks. So what did this mean in the context of the mathematics that you were doing?
So all this is like in retrospect. I think when you're doing things, you're not thinking, I can take long-term risk. You're just struggling. But this is what you learn after the event. You learn more. I mean, that's, I think, the point about a thesis, or like perhaps in many subjects, in all subjects, that it's also something by which you learn about yourself by struggling with something which is worthwhile. So what I discovered through my sort of failures is that in some ways, the strength I have, and this is what I say in the book in some ways, is that about one's own weaknesses, one is aware of, right? At least if you're reasonably kind of honest about yourself, you know really what things you can't do, right? But strengths perhaps you're not aware of. Strengths can express themselves when you actually start doing something. So strengths emerge in the process of doing something. And what I found is by engaging with questions which are very kind of long drawn out, where perhaps no one knows how to solve them, it gives you a chance to kind of engage with them. I never, even when I worked on the Sayre's conjecture, I never really thought I would solve it. I mean, I had a kind of fantasy or whatever. Maybe that someday it might work out. But the main thing was it was a beautiful question. It was interesting. It was made by a great mathematician, and somehow there was much going for it, and it drew me in. I did not expect to solve it, but this process of like being drawn in, falling, not in love, but whatever, I mean, kind of caring deeply about something is perhaps the only way to succeed at something, right? You really need to care about a question, and that's how I found that works for me. I have to find a question which somehow resonates with me, and even if it is not doable in the short term, and even if I may not hope to solve it, it will kind of take me on a journey which might lead to interesting mathematics.
So we won't have time to get into the last phase of his mathematical career, where he actually finishes his PhD and then embarks on the rest of the journey to prove the Sayre conjecture. You can read it in the book. It's all there. But I want to maybe talk about, because AI is in the air. We've had a chat about the use of AI for math, etc. I recently heard another mathematician, Akshay Venkatesh, whom you know well. He was giving a talk about AI and mathematics, and he said this: AI will transform not just mathematics but all of academia, because it will change how people think. Just as writing changed how people think, AI changes how people think. So we have to rethink what it means to be a scholar. So from your perspective, thinking of this, long, decades-long journey that you've had to do what you've done, and all of that has given your career and your life meaning, how do you see the role of AI going forward, both in your work and in mathematics in general?
I don't really know much about AI. I'm kind of a bit of a Luddite, and I don't use computers besides just using them to write email and write my papers, just as kind of word processing. But I do feel that AI is transformational. It's amazing what it does. I do use ChatGPT quite often. It kind of is, it has an amazing ability. For example, if you input text, it can analyze it and kind of structure it in a more coherent and compelling way. So it is going to change. It is going to change, as Akshay says, it's going to not only change mathematics, but a lot of different things. But I don't think there's a worry that somehow mathematicians will be out of a job. And maybe, there might be a fewer mathematicians, I don't know. But there will always, I think there will be a need for mathematicians. There needs to be someone, an adult in the room, right? Software guy, the AI can't do everything. Because humans are the people, humans are capable of having desire. Creative work is driven by desire, ambition, right? Wanting to penetrate into something, do something. Computers don't have desire. So human beings will be left with intentionality, and they will use AI as a way to kind of do it. It'll be incorporated into the practice of mathematics. It'll transform it, but there will still be a role for mathematicians, and yeah.
And you would still want to do mathematics the way you do it?
No, I would like to know. No, I would like to use AI. Why? Because in some ways, for example, I'm not very good at. There are many parts of mathematics I'm not good at. So I would love it if AI could step in there and kind of do things which I can't do. For example, in fact, Akshay probably in that talk mentioned something which is a common experience of mathematicians. So sometimes when I collaborate with a friend, with a colleague, I've gone to that colleague with a question because I feel that he or she has greater expertise or will have greater facility with that question. And often when you work with such a person, sometimes, I'm thinking of a particular collaborator I have in mind. When I collaborate with him, if I can get him interested, I don't have to do anything, right? Because once I pose the question, he's too fast for me. He'll go ahead and solve the question, right? But my role is posing the question. So in an interaction with the AI, I still feel that it might benefit my work. It will be my collaborator, and I'll pose the question, and then I can just rest. I can sit back and see what it does.
But when it comes to number theory, the kind of things that you want to do, you would rather do it yourself.
As a matter, I would like to use AI. You use AI, yeah, but not cede total control to it. But yeah, certainly use it. Yeah.
So I have a writer's question. There are a lot of places in the book where you have really vivid, descriptions of how you felt, the sensations, etc. when something happened. Like there's a place where you get off a bus in Pasadena, and this is very close to the breakthrough that you're going to have for your PhD thesis. My question as a writer is, were you taking notes about how you felt at those times, or were these moments so seminal in your memory that you recollect all these things so beautifully?
Yeah, certainly. I was certainly not taking notes. But I think, I think the character of mathematical discovery or whatever, it certainly it's very vivid. You don't forget it when it happens. So for example, I sometimes remember I was on a BST bus traveling in Bombay, and at a turning when I saw Haji Ali, I kind of had an idea. So one can even have such sort of very particular memories of certain ideas. Some of it is, of course, I have kind of, these are kind of like jazzed up elaborations of memories I have. They may not be exactly accurate about what. But somehow they're based on this, the kernel is the sensation I had when I had this idea, and then I want to expand it out and produce this writing. I think the entire attempt in this book, right? Somehow I did want to make this book appeal to someone, and I fear I may not succeed. But I wanted to make it appeal to someone who's not per se interested in mathematics, but who has some curiosity about the mathematical enterprise. So, and I wanted to create in the book, the mood of the atmosphere of mathematical research. So I want to talk about the process of how one does research and the kind of states of absorption and obsession it induces, and to find ways to talk about it. So in some ways, that's as a writer, that's what I'm trying to do in this book, create a mood and sustain it.
And you succeed brilliantly. It really does work like that. So we have only 5 minutes left. Let's open it up to the audience for questions. I think we have time for a couple of questions. So do we have mics?
Hi, I'm Darshan. I haven't read the book yet, but very interesting discussion. So the question is basically because we talked about like how number theory is infamously easy to kind of comprehend the question itself, but the proof could be like extremely complicated. I want to get your thoughts on what you think about the implications of like Gödel's theorems, in the sense that we do know like any formal system which is like strong enough to like do number theory on it is going to have true statements which cannot be proved in it, and also it cannot prove its own consistency as well. So does that discourage you in pursuing some problems, or when to, especially that you're working in like Fermat's last theorem or these kind of conjectures, which has taken 300 years, how do you decide when to give up that this could be one of those truths which cannot be solved in the axiom system we're working at? Or how do you keep going is the question. And I think one follow-up to Anil as well is...
I'll let him answer. It's his book. Have a seat.
Yeah, okay.
We're running out of time. Seriously.
Okay,
Let him answer that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I feel I would have to be, it's like being struck by lightning. You have to be singularly unlucky to think about a question which turns out to be undecidable. So mostly it's your own incompetence which is preventing you from solving it. And that's what I kind of, somehow I want to overcome bit by bit my inability to solve it, make progress. Just in probabilistic, it's highly unlikely I'm going to think of a question which turns out to be undecidable. So yeah, that's my take on it, I guess.
Good evening, Professor. Here.
Oh, there,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
My name is Rajaram. Thanks for the great session. I was intrigued by the last part about AI, what you gave an analogy of collaborating with a collaborator, right? To saying that you should know how to ask the question. So my question is, Professor, that when you're doing a research, right, you have in mind that different things you want to explore, and then one leads to the next step and what goes on. So now in the era of AI, we know what to ask the question, and without AI, probably we need to do very hard miles to get that. Now with AI, we ask that question, we get the answer, and then that we take it forward. So now, do we really consider that as a process now in this research work where we can consider it as, because there are also checks and balances where they say that declare that you have not used AI in the research. But here we use the AI to get some answer, but it is not the whole research, but it is helping you to progress forward. So in your view, do you think it's the right way to use the AI to research, where we use that output, what we are getting in the steps, and then continue the research?
I mean, I've not thought of the sort of, kind of moral implications of that, but I feel that, I mean, AI, you can just use it to brainstorm, right? I mean, at the moment, when I've tried it, it's not been very useful for me mathematically. It's very good at when I want to dictate an email and structuring all that, but for serious mathematics, I've certainly not found that it's able to answer my question. I've tried to make it do some computation, but somehow it wants to please you, I think, AI. Or at least ChatGPT, the one I use. So they always give you the answer you want to hear. And so somehow, I mean, it's not neither trustworthy nor has it been very useful for me right now. But I do feel it has a role in the future. And I think it's a legitimate tool of, I mean, as long as you acknowledge its use, as long as it's kind of a part of the process, I mean, it's totally fine, I think,
Thank you.
My view.
So we've been told we have an extra 5 minutes, so we should be able to take 2 more questions.
Hi, Chandrasekhar. So how do you decide what problems to work on? Is it internal, passion-based, or is it external, that whether if it was solved, how much value would it add to humanity, or is it something else?
For Sayre's conjecture, for example, I mean, Sayre is a very important mathematicians of the 20th century had made this conjecture. He writes beautifully, he writes clearly. So somehow the question was there. And as I said, I'm drawn also by the charisma of the person kind of doing the mathematics. So Sayre somehow had a certain appeal. And so that was in some ways, and it was a very important, I mean, it was a central question. Everyone in my subject was trying to prove it. I also was trying without any, as I said, hope of, I wasn't at all sure I would be able to do anything I would solve the conjecture. So the way I think about working on a research problem is try to do, for example, when I solved Sayre's conjecture, I did not want to continue working in that area because there are lots of smart people in my area. I don't want to compete with sort of lots of people. I wanted to work again on something where there are fewer people working. So I started thinking maybe 15 years ago on some other conjecture. But again, I mean, I went on, again, not with the hope of solving it, but on hoping that it will take me on a journey. And so for 5 years after I started thinking about that conjecture, I was lost in the wilderness. In retrospect, what I was doing was completely off the mark. But I think I like this being lost in the wilderness and then coming back to civilization, starting to use what other people have done. That process to me is important. Without failure, without kind of grappling with this, yeah. So that's my process of trying to find.
So Umesh here. Sir, my question is, I appreciate your humility on AI, but my impression was all these days that AI is based on analytics, neural networks, and mathematics. Now here is a mathematician who says that AI will be, something different than mathematics, is my impression from hearing you out. Am I right? Or mathematics does form a basis for AI?
I think it does. I don't know much about AI. Anil would probably know that. Yeah,
Mathematics certainly forms a basis for AI. I mean, it is built on mathematical principles, very much so. So that's, yeah.
No, my point was just that AI would, I mean, just as in many other endeavors, it will be useful, I think, in mathematical research as well, at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one.
I have mic.
Who has the mic?
Yeah.
Wait, there's somebody.
Oh, sure.
Hi, sir. So my question is that is there any common personality traits when it comes to someone who is pursuing maths at your level, at higher PhD level? Like you spoke about thorough and stubbornness. So I just wanted to understand that.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's the job, the beauty of the subject. There's not just one personality type which is going to succeed in it. Because it's kind of open-ended research, it can draw upon whatever quality you can offer to it. So, for example, one of the quotes I use in this book is by some 19th century French mathematician. It is the man, or it is the person, not the method, which solves the problem. So in some ways, it's not just, so your personality does count, and whatever you are, I mean, can come useful. So certainly tenacity is useful, important. I wouldn't say that I'm tenacious naturally. Like I'm always thinking, oh my God, this is way beyond me. So I have a despairing courage. I have courage, but it's like a despairing sort, not of a very confident sort that, oh, I'm going to solve this. I can't let go of it. I don't feel, but of course by now, this is especially true when I had nothing to fall back upon, for example, when I was a grad student. Now because of experience and just becoming older and having white hair, I mean, one has a sense that, one has something to fall back upon. But yeah, tenacity certainly is useful, the desire to kind of hang in, the ability to hang in there, and tenacity is a useful trait, yes.
And maybe last question, yeah?
Hello, hi, I'm Parveen. I like the fact that you put great emphasis on the journey of discovery, right? I have my daughter here with me. I want to know, as a mathematician, how should mathematical learning in India revolutionize in future so that children like my daughter are not afraid of maths and they enjoy the journey?
Yeah, I think often finding a good teacher, right? Having a good teacher in school or somewhere, that can be transformational, because somehow, I mean, the mathematics or anything of a theoretical nature, to make it come alive to you, it's sometimes good for someone to explain it to you. And so, yeah, to have good teachers, I think is, and good company, to have cohort, have other students, people around you who are interested, that certainly is good.
Well, hang on,
We are out of time.
Yeah?
No, we're out of time, sorry.
So, sorry about that. Shekhar is around, so if he's willing, you can catch him outside of the confines of this. So, thank you very much for attending, and Shekhar, thank you very much for this.
Yeah.
I seriously recommend this book for that young woman there. You can start by reading Chasing a Conjecture.